In the vast expanse of the Iranian plateau, where the morning sun casts its first golden rays across endless horizons of desert and mountain, the winds carry whispers of ancient grandeur. Here, beneath skies that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties, the stones themselves seem to remember the footsteps of kings who once commanded the greatest empire the world had ever known. The ruins of Persepolis stand as silent testament to their glory, weathered columns reaching toward heaven like fingers of a civilization that stretched its influence from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus River. It was in this landscape of profound beauty and harsh realities that a young nobleman named Darius first drew breath. Born into a world where power was measured not merely in gold or armies, but in the ability to unite disparate peoples under a single banner. The Achaemenid dynasty, of which he was a distant member, had already begun to cast its shadow across the known world. Yet Darius himself remained far from the throne, watching from the periphery as the great game of empire unfolded around him. His early years were spent in the traditional manner of Persian nobility, learning the arts of war and diplomacy, studying the sacred texts of Zoroaster, and developing the keen political instincts that would one day reshape the ancient world. The death of Cyrus the Great had left the empire in the capable hands of his son Cambyses, yet fate would soon intervene in ways that no prophet could have foreseen. When Cambyses embarked upon his conquest of Egypt, leaving the heartland of Persia under the watchful eye of trusted administrators, a crisis emerged that would test the very foundations of Achaemenid rule. The mysterious figure known as Gaumata, claiming to be Bardia, the brother of Cambyses, seized control of the empire while the king was far from home, establishing himself upon the throne through a combination of cunning and popular support from those who had grown weary of Cambyses' harsh rule. Darius, though still young and relatively unknown, possessed qualities that would soon distinguish him from the other nobles who watched these events unfold with growing concern. His mind was sharp and calculating, capable of seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. And his understanding of statecraft had been honed through careful observation of the empire's intricate administrative machinery. When word reached the Persian heartland that Cambyses had died under mysterious circumstances during his hasty return from Egypt, leaving the usurper Gaumata in apparent control of the vast territories that stretched from Libya to Bactria, Darius recognized that the moment for decisive action had arrived. The conspiracy that formed around Darius was not born of desperate ambition alone, but rather of a genuine concern for the stability of the empire that Cyrus had built with such vision and care. 6 other Persian nobles joined with Darius in this dangerous undertaking, each bringing their own networks of loyalty and influence to bear upon the challenge of unseating a ruler who had managed to consolidate power with surprising effectiveness. The stakes could not have been higher, for failure would mean not merely death, but the complete destruction of their families and the probable collapse of the Achaemenid dynasty itself. The assassination of Gaumata was accomplished with surgical precision, carried out within the walls of a fortress in Media, where the usurper had believed himself secure. Yet killing a king, even a false one, was merely the beginning of Darius's challenges, for the empire immediately erupted into rebellion as various satraps and subject peoples seized upon the apparent weakness at its center. From Babylon to Bactria, from Armenia to Arabia, revolts flared like wildfire across the imperial domains, each threatening to tear away another piece of the magnificent structure that Cyrus had so carefully constructed. What followed was a period of warfare so intense and far-reaching that it would forever cement Darius's reputation as one of history's greatest military strategists. Unlike many rulers who delegated the conduct of campaigns to their generals, Darius took personal command of the most critical battles, leading his forces with a combination of tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership that gradually turned the tide against the rebels. The great rock relief at Behistun, carved into the living stone of a cliff face that towers above the ancient road between Babylon and Ecbatana, captures the essence of these victories in images that have endured for over 2 millennia. The inscription at Behistun, composed in 3 languages, to ensure that all subjects of the empire could understand its message, tells the story of Darius's triumph in his own words. Yet even these carefully chosen phrases cannot fully convey the magnitude of his achievement. Within the span of a few short years, he had not merely restored order to the empire, but had strengthened and expanded it beyond even the dreams of its founder. The administrative reforms that he implemented during this period would become the foundation upon which Persian power rested for the next 2 centuries, creating a system of governance so efficient and flexible that it would be studied and emulated by empires throughout history. Central to Darius's vision was the concept of unity within diversity, the radical notion that an empire could be strengthened rather than weakened by embracing the varied cultures and traditions of its subject peoples. Rather than imposing a uniform Persian culture across his domains, he encouraged local customs and religions while establishing overarching systems of law and administration that ensured loyalty to the crown. This approach required a delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy, one that demanded constant attention and adjustment as new territories were added to the imperial fold. The construction of roads became one of the most visible symbols of this new order, with the Great Royal Road stretching across nearly 2,000 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east. Along these carefully maintained highways, mounted messengers carried the king's word to the farthest corners of the empire, while merchants and pilgrims travelled in relative safety under the protection of imperial law. Rest stations were established at regular intervals, each equipped with fresh horses and provisions, creating a communications network that enabled Darius to govern territories of unprecedented size with remarkable efficiency. Perhaps nowhere was this genius for organization more evident than in the creation of the satrap system, a method of provincial governance that balanced imperial oversight with local knowledge and authority. Each satrap, or provincial governor, was responsible for maintaining order within his assigned territory, collecting taxes, and providing troops when called upon, yet they were also expected to respect local traditions and customs. This system was reinforced by a network of inspectors known as the King's Eyes and Ears, officials who travelled throughout the empire, ensuring that the satraps remained loyal and that imperial policies were being properly implemented. The wealth that flowed into the royal treasuries through this efficient system of governance enabled Darius to undertake building projects of extraordinary ambition and beauty. The ceremonial capital at Persepolis, begun during his reign, represented not merely an expression of royal power, but a celebration of the empire's diversity and unity. Delegations from across the known world were carved into the stone staircases leading to the great audience halls, each depicted in their traditional dress and bearing tribute that reflected their homeland's unique contributions to the imperial economy. As the years passed, and the empire enjoyed unprecedented prosperity under his rule, Darius began to turn his attention toward the world beyond his borders, where new challenges and opportunities beckoned with equal promise and peril. The Greek city-states, with their experiments in democracy and their fierce independence, represented a different model of civilization, one that would soon test the limits of Persian power and adaptability. Yet this is a tale for another moment in the great sweep of history, for the foundations that Darius laid during his remarkable transformation from nobleman to great king would echo through the centuries, influencing the course of human civilization long after the last Persian emperor had fallen, and the desert winds had begun their patient work of reclaiming the monuments to his glory. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vast courtyards of Persepolis, as Darius, now secure upon the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever known, turned his attention to the monumental task of governance that lay before him. The sprawling territories under Persian rule stretched from the scorching deserts of Libya to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the fertile deltas of the Nile to the windswept steppes beyond the Oxus River. Each dawn brought reports from distant lands where different peoples spoke in foreign tongues, worshipped unfamiliar gods, and lived according to customs as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. In the cool marble halls of the palace, Scribes bent over their tablets as messengers arrived with dispatches that told of harvests and famines, of tribal movements and merchant caravans, of construction projects and military campaigns unfolding across 23 distinct provinces. The sheer scale of information flowing toward the center of power would have overwhelmed lesser rulers. But Darius possessed a mind that could grasp the intricate patterns of administration with the same clarity that a master weaver understands the interplay of warp and weft. Where chaos threatened to fragment his vast domain, he envisioned order emerging through systematic organization. The genius of the satrap system began to take shape in the royal workshops, where architects and administrators worked side by side, creating not monuments of stone, but frameworks of governance that would endure for centuries. Each province, or satrapy, would be entrusted to a governor chosen for his loyalty, wisdom, and understanding of local conditions. These satraps would serve as the king's eyes and ears, his hands and voice, carrying the authority of the Persian crown into every corner of the empire, while respecting the ancient traditions that bound communities together. From the cedar-scented mountains of Lebanon came word of the first appointments, as trusted nobles accepted the weighty responsibility of governing entire peoples. In Egypt, where the Nile's annual flood cycle determined the rhythm of life, a Persian satrap would learn to read the river's moods and coordinate the complex irrigation systems that fed the granaries of Memphis and Thebes. The geometric precision of Egyptian administrative records, carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls, would blend with Persian efficiency to create a hybrid system more effective than either culture could have achieved alone. Eastward in Bactria, where the Silk Roads converged amid oasis cities shimmering in the desert heat, another satrap would master the delicate art of balancing the interests of settled farmers with those of nomadic herders whose movements followed patterns older than recorded history. The jingle of camel bells and the creak of ox-drawn wagons would carry news of his decisions across trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the markets of India and the mysterious lands beyond. In the mountainous regions of Armenia, where villages clung to rocky slopes like eagles' nests, the satrap would navigate terrain as challenging politically as it was geographically. Ancient clan loyalties ran deeper than mountain springs, and the art of governance required understanding which valleys harbored old grievances and which peaks offered strategic advantages. The smoke rising from highland forges, where metal workers hammered iron into tools and weapons, would mingle with incense from Persian fire altars, creating a visual metaphor for the cultural synthesis taking place throughout the empire. The administrative machinery that Darius constructed operated with the precision of a water clock, measuring not hours but the steady flow of tribute, taxes, and tribute that sustained imperial power. Each satrapy contributed according to its wealth and resources, but the assessment reflected careful calculation rather than arbitrary demand. Rich agricultural provinces like Babylonia, where date palms cast shade over barley fields irrigated by ancient canals, would provide grain and silver in quantities that reflected their fertile abundance. Mountain regions, rich in metals, would contribute worked iron, copper, and precious ornaments crafted by skilled artisans whose techniques had been perfected over generations. The roads that connected these diverse provinces became the arteries through which the lifeblood of empire flowed, carrying more than commercial goods and military dispatches. Along the royal road that stretched from Sardis to Susa, relay stations maintained fresh horses for the king's messengers, ensuring that news could traverse the empire's breadth in a matter of weeks rather than months. Persian engineers, drawing upon centuries of accumulated knowledge, constructed bridges that spanned rushing torrents and carved passages through mountain barriers that had once seemed impassable. Communication across such vast distances required innovation in record-keeping and translation. The royal chancellery employed scribes fluent in dozens of languages and scripts, from the cuneiform wedges of Mesopotamia to the elegant curves of Aramaic letters that had become the diplomatic lingua franca of the Western territories. Leather scrolls and clay tablets bore identical messages rendered in multiple languages, ensuring that royal edicts could be understood whether they reached the courts of Phoenician city-states or the tribal councils of Central Asian nomads. Within each satrapy, the Persian system demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting to local conditions while maintaining overall coherence. In Ionia, where Greek city-states had developed sophisticated forms of democratic governance, Persian satraps often worked through existing institutions rather than imposing alien administrative structures. The marble columns of Greek temples continued to support pediments adorned with familiar mythological scenes, while Persian gold flowed through established banking networks that had grown alongside Mediterranean commerce. The satrap of India faced perhaps the most complex challenge, governing territories where monsoon rains created seasonal rhythms unknown in the Iranian highlands. Ancient cities along the Indus River, with their sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights and measures, required administrators who could appreciate the mathematical precision underlying urban planning concepts that predated Persian rule by centuries. Elephants trumpeted in royal processions that now honored Persian overlords while maintaining the pageantry and ritual that validated authority in Indian eyes. Religious tolerance became both a practical necessity and a philosophical principle underlying the satrap system. Persian fire altars appeared alongside local shrines without displacing them, creating sacred landscapes where different traditions could coexist. In Jerusalem, where Jewish priests had returned from Babylonian exile to rebuild their temple, Persian resources supported the reconstruction, while Persian law protected religious practices that seemed foreign to Iranian sensibilities. The sound of Hebrew chants and the scent of burning frankincense mingled with the architectural forms and decorative motifs that reflected Persian imperial aesthetics. The genius of Darius's administrative innovation lay not merely in its organizational efficiency, but in its recognition that sustainable empire required the voluntary cooperation of subject peoples. Each satrap served as a cultural translator, interpreting imperial policies in terms that resonated with local values, while ensuring that regional interests aligned with broader strategic objectives. Tax collectors became familiar figures in marketplaces where merchants spoke a dozen different languages, their presence accepted because the tribute they gathered funded public works projects that benefited entire communities. Military garrisons, stationed throughout the satrapies, provided security for trade routes and supported the satrap's authority, but their presence remained deliberately unobtrusive. Persian soldiers learned to appreciate local customs while maintaining their distinctive identity through uniform equipment and training methods that emphasized discipline and loyalty to the great king. Veterans who served their terms in distant provinces often chose to remain, marrying local women and establishing families that bridged cultural divides through personal bonds stronger than political alliances. The palace archives at Persepolis gradually filled with detailed records documenting the intricate workings of this administrative masterpiece. Scribes recorded not only tribute payments and military deployments, but also information about local customs, seasonal patterns, and the personal characteristics of individual officials serving in remote postings. The accumulated knowledge represented a comprehensive understanding of human geography that enabled Persian rulers to govern diverse populations with unprecedented effectiveness. As seasons turned and years passed, the satrap system proved its worth through its ability to adapt and evolve. Regional challenges that might have fragmented a less flexible empire became opportunities for administrative innovation, as successful solutions developed in one province could be modified and implemented elsewhere. The genius of Darius had created not merely a system of governance, but a living organism capable of growth and adaptation, setting the stage for the dramatic confrontations with Greece that would define his son Xerxes' reign. The administrative genius that bound 23 provinces into a single empire required more than governors and decrees. It demanded something revolutionary in the ancient world: a circulatory system of roads, messengers, and trade routes that could pulse with information and wealth across distances that had previously rendered communication impossible. Like arteries carrying lifeblood through a vast body, Darius conceived and constructed what would become known as the Royal Road. a masterpiece of engineering and organization that transformed the very concept of empire. Stretching nearly 1,700 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in the heart of Persia, the Royal Road became the backbone of Persian power. This was not merely a path worn by countless feet and hooves, but a carefully planned highway that sliced through mountains, bridged rivers, and carved its way across deserts with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Every 20 miles, way stations arose like jewels strung along a golden thread, each one a fortress, inn, and supply depot rolled into one. These stations, called chaparkhana, housed fresh horses, provisions, and armed guards who protected the constant flow of royal messengers racing between the far corners of the empire. The construction of such a road required the mobilization of entire populations. Stonecutters from the quarries of Media shaped the foundations, while engineers from Babylon calculated the precise grades needed to carry the highway over the Zagros Mountains. Skilled bridge builders from Phoenicia designed the spans that would carry traffic across the rushing waters of the Halys River, while desert nomads shared their knowledge of hidden oases and safe passages through the burning sands of Syria. The road became a testament to Persian pragmatism, incorporating local expertise while serving imperial purposes, much like the empire itself. Along this great highway, the sound of hoofbeats never ceased. The Persian postal system, known as the Angarium, operated with mechanical precision that would not be equaled until the modern era. Royal messengers, called astandes, thundered along the road day and night, each man covering his assigned section at breakneck speed before passing imperial dispatches to the next rider in an unbroken chain of communication. These couriers, selected for their horsemanship and loyalty, carried the sealed orders of kings, the urgent reports of satraps, and the intelligence that kept the empire's vast machinery functioning smoothly. The efficiency of this system bordered on the miraculous by ancient standards. A message that would have taken a lone traveller 3 months to carry from Sardis to Susa could now arrive in less than a week. The Greek historian Herodotus marvelled at these Persian couriers, writing words that would later inspire the motto of postal services across the world. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night stayed these swift messengers from the completion of their appointed rounds. The royal road had compressed distance and time, bringing the periphery of the empire within speaking distance of its heart. But the road served purposes far beyond the delivery of royal correspondence. It became the empire's commercial spine, along which flowed the wealth of nations in an endless procession of caravans. Merchant trains stretched for miles, their camels and oxen laden with precious cargo that represented the diversity and richness of Persian domains. From India came spices that filled the air with exotic fragrances, their scents mixing with the dust raised by countless feet and hooves. Ivory tusks swayed in specially designed carriers, while bolts of silk from the distant east caught the sunlight like captured rainbows. The metalworkers of Armenia sent their finest bronze vessels and silver cups along the road, their surfaces gleaming despite the dust of travel. From the workshops of Phoenician craftsmen came purple-dyed textiles worth their weight in gold, the deep royal colour reserved for the elite who could afford such luxury. Egyptian linen, fine as spiders' webs, travelled in carefully sealed containers that protected the delicate fabric from the harsh elements of the journey. The famous Persian carpets, woven with patterns that told stories of ancient myths and royal hunts, were rolled and wrapped with infinite care for their long journey to distant markets. Persian merchants had developed sophisticated systems for managing this complex trade network. Letters of credit, written on parchment and sealed with intricate stamps, allowed traders to conduct business across vast distances without carrying dangerous quantities of precious metal. Banks established in major cities along the route would honor these documents, creating an early form of international finance that facilitated commerce on an unprecedented scale. The satrap system that Darius had created worked hand in hand with these financial innovations, providing the stability and legal framework necessary for such ambitious commercial ventures to flourish. The caravanserai that dotted the royal road became cosmopolitan crossroads, where cultures blended and languages mixed in a constant babble of commercial activity. These fortified inns, built around central courtyards, large enough to accommodate entire merchant trains, offered protection from bandits and shelter from savage weather. In their common rooms, traders from Greece shared wine with merchants from India, while Egyptian dealers in precious stones negotiated with Persian buyers of fine horses. The evening meals in these establishments featured cuisine from across the known world, as cooks adapted their traditional recipes to available ingredients and foreign palates. Local populations along the road found their lives transformed by this constant flow of people and goods. Farmers discovered markets for their produce that extended far beyond their immediate neighbors, while craftsmen found demand for their skills in maintaining the endless stream of vehicles, harnesses, and equipment that passed their doors. Blacksmiths became specialists in shoeing the thousands of horses that carried the empire's messages, while wheelwrights developed new techniques for building carts capable of surviving the punishing journey across such varied terrain. The royal road also served as a conduit for ideas and innovations that proved as valuable as any material cargo. Persian engineers learned irrigation techniques from Mesopotamian farmers, while Greek architectural concepts traveled eastward to influence the construction of palaces in Persepolis. Medical knowledge from Egyptian physicians spread throughout the empire, mixing with healing traditions from India and local folk remedies to create new approaches to treating disease and injury. The road carried not just goods and messages, but the intellectual wealth of civilizations. This vast network required constant maintenance and protection. Teams of workers stationed at regular intervals along the route repaired damage caused by weather and heavy traffic, replacing worn stones and filling dangerous potholes that could lame horses or break wagon wheels. During the winter months, when snow made travel treacherous, these crews worked tirelessly to keep the passes open, understanding that the empire's very survival depended on maintaining communication between its scattered parts. The Persian military had designed the road system with strategic considerations always in mind. Fortresses commanded key mountain passes and river crossings, their garrisons ready to defend these vital choke points against any force that might threaten the empire's lifelines. The spacing of way stations reflected not just the needs of messengers and merchants, but the calculated distances that military units could cover in forced marches. In times of rebellion or foreign invasion, the royal road could rapidly transform from a commercial highway into a strategic corridor for moving troops and supplies to threatened frontiers. The psychological impact of this infrastructure proved as important as its practical benefits. Subject peoples throughout the empire could see and hear the constant evidence of Persian power and organization passing through their lands. The thunder of hoofbeats in the night, the sight of royal couriers bearing the king's seal, the endless procession of merchants conducting business under Persian protection, all served as daily reminders of the empire's reach and efficiency. The road itself became a symbol of Persian authority, its very existence proof that the great king's word could reach any corner of his domains within days rather than months. As Darius's reign progressed, this remarkable system of roads and communications would prove its worth again and again, binding together an empire that spanned 3 continents and dozens of distinct cultures. The wealth that flowed along these routes would fund the great building projects at Persepolis and Susa, while the information that travelled with royal messengers would allow Persian kings to govern their vast territories with an effectiveness that amazed their contemporaries. The royal road and its supporting infrastructure represented more than mere engineering prowess. They embodied the Persian genius for organization and integration that transformed conquest into lasting imperial unity. Through this vast network of roads and messengers, word travelled swiftly to the heart of the empire when rebellion erupted in the distant Greek cities of Ionia. The Persian royal road that had carried so many peaceful dispatches now hummed with urgent communications about burning temples and defiant city-states along the Aegean coast. Darius, seated in his audience hall at Persepolis, received these reports with the measured calm of a ruler who had weathered countless storms, yet beneath his composed exterior, something deeper stirred. a recognition that this distant uprising represented more than mere provincial unrest. The Ionian Revolt had begun in 499 BCE, sparked by the ambitious Aristagoras of Miletus, but it was the involvement of Athens and Eretria that transformed a regional disturbance into a personal affront to the great king. 20 Athenian ships had crossed the wine-dark Aegean to support their Ionian kinsmen, and together they had marched inland to Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia and seat of Persian power in the west. The flames that consumed the lower city and licked at the walls of the Acropolis sent smoke signals that could be seen for miles across the Lydian plain, but their true message travelled much farther, all the way to the golden halls of Persepolis. In the months that followed, Persian forces methodically crushed the rebellion, city by city, island by island, with the inexorable patience that characterized all imperial campaigns. Miletus fell after a siege that saw its mighty walls breached and its population scattered across the empire, sold into slavery or relocated to distant satrapies, where their memories of Ionian independence could take no root. The sacred island of Delos witnessed Persian ships anchoring in its harbours, their bronze-beaked prows cutting through waters that had known only Greek vessels for generations. Yet for Darius, the suppression of Ionia was merely the prelude to a grander design. The great king commanded his servants to remind him daily of the Athenian transgression, the story tells, though the truth ran deeper than personal vengeance. Athens represented something fundamentally alien to the Persian worldview, a city that acknowledged no king, where citizens gathered in assembly to debate matters that elsewhere remained the sole prerogative of rulers appointed by divine mandate. The very existence of such a place challenged the natural order that had elevated the Achaemenids to their throne, suggesting that men might govern themselves without the guiding hand of royal authority, blessed by Ahura Mazda. Preparations for the expedition began with the methodical thoroughness that marked all Persian military endeavours. Ships were commissioned from the Phoenician cities, their master craftsmen working through the winter months to shape cedar and oak into the sleek galleys that would carry Persian power across the Aegean. In the inland cities of the empire, smiths hammered bronze and iron into spear points and sword blades, their forges glowing through the night as they equipped an army destined for lands where olive trees grew wild on rocky hillsides, and the sea stretched beyond the horizon in shades of blue that had no names in Persian. The command of this expedition fell to Mardonius, nephew to the great king, and a man whose ambitions matched his royal blood. In the spring of 492 BCE, he led his forces westward along the familiar routes that Persian armies had travelled before. But this time, the destination lay beyond the established boundaries of the empire, across waters where Persian ships had ventured only as merchants or diplomats. The army that marched with Mardonius represented the diversity of the empire itself. Persians and Medes in their flowing robes, Scythian horsemen with their curved bows, Phoenician marines who knew every current and wind of the eastern Mediterranean. The campaign began with successes that seemed to validate Persian confidence in their inevitable victory. Thrace submitted without significant resistance, its tribal chiefs recognizing the futility of opposing the great king's forces and accepting the tribute arrangements that would bind them to the empire. Macedonian nobles, including a young prince named Alexander, offered tokens of submission that were received with the ceremonial gravity appropriate to such moments. The Persian advance appeared unstoppable, a tide of imperial power flowing westward toward its appointed collision with Greek defiance. Then the Aegean Sea revealed why sailors had feared its waters since men first ventured beyond sight of land in fragile wooden vessels. A storm of unprecedented fury struck the Persian fleet as it rounded the rocky promontory of Mount Athos, where marble cliffs rise sheer from waters that can turn from mirror calm to mountainous in the space of a single hour. The winds that mariners called the Etesians, the yearly gifts of the gods, became instruments of destruction as they drove Persian ships against the jagged rocks with crushing force. 300 vessels shattered against the unforgiving stone, their bronze rams and painted eyes disappearing beneath waves that showed no mercy to imperial ambitions. 20,000 men perished in those churning waters, their bodies washing ashore on beaches that would remember this disaster long after the political arrangements that had brought them there were forgotten. Among the dead were Phoenician captains, whose knowledge of these waters had seemed guarantee against such catastrophe, Persian nobles, whose names were inscribed in the records at Persepolis, and countless soldiers and sailors whose only memorial would be the silence that followed their absence from distant villages throughout the empire. Mardonius himself survived the naval disaster only to face humiliation on land, where Thracian tribes that had submitted so readily now sensed weakness and struck at Persian supply lines with the sudden fury of mountain wolves. The nephew of the great king found himself wounded in a night attack that left his personal guard decimated and his authority in tatters. The expedition that had begun with such confidence limped back toward the established borders of the empire, leaving behind not conquest, but questions about the limits of Persian power. Yet Darius was not a ruler to be deterred by a single setback, however dramatic. In the royal workshops of his capitals, plans took shape for a different approach to the Greek problem, one that would bypass the treacherous waters of the northern Aegean and strike directly across the island-dotted sea toward the heart of Athenian power. This second expedition would be entrusted not to a single commander, but to two generals of proven ability, Artaphernes, son of the satrap of Sardis, and Datis, a Median noble whose experience in amphibious warfare had been demonstrated in campaigns across the empire. The fleet that assembled for this new venture dwarfed its predecessor, its 600 ships representing the combined maritime power of the empire's subject peoples. Phoenician war galleys rode at anchor alongside Ionian triremes, whose Greek crews now served Persian masters, while Egyptian grain ships heavy with supplies shared the harbours with Cilician pirate vessels transformed into instruments of imperial policy. The horses that would carry Persian cavalry across Greek plains were loaded into specially designed transports, their nervous whickering adding to the cacophony of preparation that echoed across every major port of the eastern Mediterranean. This time, the route would lead directly across the Aegean's island chains, each stepping stone carefully chosen to provide bases for the systematic reduction of Greek resistance. Naxos fell first, its population enslaved or scattered as a demonstration of Persian resolve that sent tremors of fear across the island world. Delos, sacred to Apollo and theoretically neutral in all mortal conflicts, submitted without resistance and was spared destruction in recognition of its religious significance, a gesture that revealed the complex relationship between Persian practicality and respect for divine authority. The fleet that finally approached the coast of Attica in the late summer of 490 BCE carried with it not just the military might of the empire, but the accumulated weight of Persian expectation. For 8 years, since the flames of Sardis had first announced Greek defiance to the world, this moment had been inevitable. The ships that now beached on the sandy shores of Marathon Bay brought with them the focused attention of the great king himself. Though Darius remained in his palace thousands of miles away, confident that Greek resistance would collapse before the disciplined advance of imperial forces, as it had in a dozen other lands across 3 continents. The plain of Marathon stretched inland from the sea, bordered by hills where Greek scouts watched the methodical Persian deployment with growing apprehension. 25,000 soldiers of the empire established their camp within sight of the waves that had carried them across the wine-dark sea, their colourful banners and gleaming weapons creating a vista that spoke of power drawn from the corners of the world and focused on this single moment of destiny. The dust of Marathon had barely settled when whispers began to spread through the marble corridors of Persepolis, carried on desert winds that seemed to know the weight of imperial disappointment. Darius the Great, King of Kings, ruler of 23 satrapies stretching from the burning sands of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, found himself facing something far more dangerous than any barbarian army: the slow, inexorable advance of mortal time. The defeat at Marathon had not broken his spirit, but it had revealed cracks in the foundation of his ambition, hairline fractures that would widen with each passing season until they consumed the very essence of his being. In the months following the disaster on that coastal plain, Darius threw himself into preparations for a second expedition with the fervor of a man racing against his own mortality. The great administrative machinery of the Persian Empire, that marvel of organization that had made him master of the known world, hummed with renewed purpose as tribute flowed in from distant provinces and shipwrights labored in coastal yards from Phoenicia to the Aegean. Yet those closest to the king began to notice subtle changes in his bearing, a slight tremor in hands that had once signed death warrants without hesitation, a tendency to stare into middle distance as if watching shadows that only he could perceive. The palace at Persepolis, that testament to Persian grandeur, with its soaring columns and intricate reliefs depicting endless processions of tribute-bearers, became both sanctuary and prison for the aging monarch. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of nations, Darius would spend long hours poring over maps that seemed to mock him with their careful delineation of territories that remained stubbornly unconquered. The Aegean Sea appeared as a thin blue line on these charts, yet it might as well have been an ocean of molten bronze for all the trouble it had caused his armies. Greek names dotted the coastlines like thorns: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, each representing a challenge to the natural order that placed the Persian king above all earthly rulers. As winter settled over the Iranian plateau, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of cold winds whistling through the palace complexes, Darius felt the weight of his years settling into his bones like sediment in a riverbed. The fire altars that burned eternally in the sacred precincts seemed to flicker with less certainty, their flames casting dancing shadows that reminded him of the warriors who had fled from Marathon's bloody shore. Sleep, once a refuge from the demands of ruling half the world, became elusive, haunted by visions of Greek phalanxes and the terrible sound of bronze spears striking Persian shields. The rebellion that erupted in Egypt provided a welcome distraction from these darker contemplations, demanding the kind of swift, decisive action that had characterized Darius's entire reign. The Egyptians, those ancient people who had built monuments when the Persians were still wandering nomads, had chosen this moment of apparent Persian weakness to throw off the yoke of imperial rule. Their timing was impeccable, their judgment of Persian resilience fatally flawed. Darius gathered his remaining strength like a cloak around his shoulders, and prepared to remind his subjects why the Achaemenid dynasty had conquered an empire that dwarfed even the legendary realms of Babylon and Assyria. Yet, even as he marshaled his forces for the Egyptian campaign, the King of Kings could feel something fundamental shifting within the vast machinery of his body. The vital force that had sustained him through decades of conquest and administration seemed to be ebbing like tide from a coastal marsh, leaving behind only the dry bones of duty and the bitter taste of incomplete ambition. His physicians, learned men who had studied in the ancient schools of Babylon and Memphis, spoke in hushed tones of imbalances in the royal constitution, of humours gone astray and celestial influences grown malevolent. They prescribed remedies drawn from the furthest reaches of the empire, rare herbs from the mountains of Bactria, pearls dissolved in wine from the Persian Gulf, incantations in languages so old their meanings had been forgotten by all save a handful of priests. The end, when it came, arrived with the peculiar suddenness that characterizes the death of great men, as if the universe itself had grown weary of sustaining such an enormous concentration of power within a single mortal frame. In the 36th year of his reign, as autumn painted the mountains around Persepolis in shades of bronze and gold that matched the ceremonial armor hanging in his private chambers, Darius felt the final threads that bound his spirit to his earthly kingdom begin to fray. The great heart that had pumped ambition through the arteries of an empire fell still on a cool October morning, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo through every corner of the known world. The rituals that followed the king's death unfolded with the precision of a cosmic dance, each gesture and ceremony prescribed by traditions that reached back to the dawn of Persian greatness. The royal body was prepared according to ancient customs, treated with precious spices and wrapped in silk that had travelled the length of the royal road from distant China. Fire altars blazed across the empire as news of the royal death spread along the same routes that had once carried Darius's commands to the edges of civilization. In Egypt, the rebels paused in their celebration to contemplate the uncertain future that lay ahead. In the Greek cities, men gathered in agoras and gymnasia to debate what the death of their greatest enemy might mean for the delicate balance of power that governed their fractured world. But it was in the royal quarters of Persepolis itself that the death of Darius carried the most profound implications. For here, his eldest son, Xerxes, prepared to assume the weight of a crown that ruled more human beings than any single man in history had ever commanded. The transition of power in the Persian Empire was never a simple matter of hereditary succession. It required the complex orchestration of court factions, the careful management of ambitious relatives, and the delicate negotiation of relationships with powerful satraps who governed distant provinces with almost kingly authority. Xerxes, now 34 years old and seasoned by years of administrative responsibility, moved through these challenges with the calculated precision of a master craftsman shaping precious metal. The new King of Kings possessed many of his father's qualities. The same imposing physical presence, the same keen intelligence that could grasp the intricacies of governing a multinational empire, the same appreciation for the ceremonial splendor that made Persian rule seem almost divine to subject peoples. Yet there were differences, subtle but significant, that would prove crucial in the years to come. Where Darius had been methodical and patient, willing to spend decades consolidating his gains before pressing forward, Xerxes burned with a more intense flame, eager to surpass his father's achievements and add his own chapters to the epic of Persian conquest. The unfinished business of Greece hung over the new reign like an unpaid debt, a challenge to Persian prestige that demanded resolution. As winter deepened around Persepolis, and the first snows began to dust the ceremonial staircases that led to the Apadana, Xerxes found himself master of an empire that stretched across 3 continents and encompassed nearly every variety of human civilization. From the temples of Memphis to the trading posts of Sogdiana, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the pearl fisheries of the Persian Gulf, millions of subjects now looked to this tall, bearded figure as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the source of law and order in a world that seemed perpetually balanced on the edge of chaos. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed a lesser man, but Xerxes had been prepared for this moment from birth, trained in the arts of kingship as thoroughly as a warrior learns the use of sword and spear. The great throne room at Persepolis, where Darius had received the tribute of nations and dispensed justice to petitioners from across the known world, now echoed with the footsteps of a new master. Here, surrounded by reliefs that depicted the eternal submission of the world to Persian rule, Xerxes began to contemplate the shape of his own reign and the legacy he would leave carved in stone and written in the memories of men. The ghost of Marathon haunted these deliberations like a persistent desert wind, reminding the young king that his father's greatest ambition remained unfulfilled and that somewhere across the Aegean, Greek warriors still boasted of their victory over the armies of the great king. The great king was dead, and across the vast expanse of the Persian Empire, the news travelled like ripples across still water, carried by swift horsemen along the royal road that stretched from Sardis to Susa. In the golden halls of Persepolis, where the carved reliefs of tribute-bearing nations adorned the walls in endless procession, Xerxes received the crown of his father with the weight of destiny upon his shoulders. The young king stood nearly 7 feet tall, his bearing magnificent and his presence commanding, yet within his chest burned an ambition that threatened to consume not merely Greece, but the very foundations of the world itself. The empire that Xerxes inherited sprawled across 3 continents, like a great tapestry woven from countless threads of culture, language, and tradition. From the snow-capped mountains of Scythia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia to the windswept plateaus of Anatolia, 28 satrapies bowed before the King of Kings. Yet for all this immeasurable wealth and power, one corner of the known world remained defiant. One small collection of city-states that had dared to burn Sardis and defeat Persian armies at Marathon. The insult festered in the royal mind like a wound that would not heal. Within the first year of his reign, Xerxes had made his decision, though the preparations that followed would consume nearly 4 years of meticulous planning and unprecedented mobilization. The invasion of Greece would not be the swift punitive expedition that Mardonius had once proposed, nor even the focused campaign that Darius had attempted. Instead, it would be a demonstration of Persian might, so overwhelming that no nation would ever again dare to defy the will of the great king. Every corner of the empire would contribute to this grand endeavor, every people would send their finest warriors, and every resource would be marshaled for what would become the largest military expedition in the history of the ancient world. The gathering began slowly, like the first drops of rain that herald a mighty storm. Messengers bearing the royal seal departed from Persepolis and Susa, traveling to every satrap and governor throughout the empire with instructions that brooked no delay or excuse. From Bactria came the fierce horsemen of the steppes, their felt caps adorned with gold and their composite bows capable of sending arrows through Persian armor at 300 paces. The mountains of Armenia yielded regiments of spearmen whose ancestors had fought alongside the Eurasians against the armies of Assyria, while from the southern reaches of Arabia rode warriors whose camels could cross waterless deserts that would claim the lives of ordinary men. As the seasons turned and the preparations gathered momentum, the ancient city of Sardis began its transformation into something unprecedented in human history. The capital of the Lydian satrapy, already wealthy from the gold that washed down from Mount Tmolus and the trade that flowed along the royal road, swelled beyond all recognition as contingents from across the empire converged upon its walls. The markets overflowed with exotic goods and unfamiliar tongues, while the surrounding plains sprouted a forest of tents that stretched beyond the horizon like a vast nomadic city. The logistics of feeding and housing such a multitude challenged even the efficient Persian administrative system. Granaries throughout western Anatolia emptied their stores to supply the growing army, while herds of cattle, sheep, and goats arrived in endless streams from the fertile pastures of Cappadocia and Phrygia. Rivers of wine flowed from the hillside vineyards of Lydia and Ionia, while olive oil arrived by the shipload from Phoenician merchants who sensed unprecedented profits in the royal preparations. The smoke from countless cooking fires rose into the sky like incense offered to the gods, and the sound of hammering rang from dawn to dusk as smiths forged spear points, arrowheads, and bronze fittings for the endless ranks of warriors. Engineers and architects labored alongside the common soldiers, for Xerxes had decreed that this expedition would overcome every obstacle that had hindered previous campaigns. Where the waters of the Hellespont had scattered the bridges of lesser kings, Persian ingenuity would create a causeway that would allow the army to march from Asia to Europe as easily as crossing a palace courtyard. Phoenician and Egyptian shipwrights, masters of their ancient crafts, supervised the construction of hundreds of triremes and transport vessels, their bronze rams gleaming like the teeth of sea monsters, and their sails bearing the royal insignia of the Achaemenid house. The diversity of the gathering army reflected the true scope of Persian dominion, each contingent bringing not merely their weapons and warriors, but their own distinct character and fighting traditions. Ethiopian archers arrived with bows carved from exotic woods, and arrows tipped with obsidian that could pierce the finest bronze, their dark skin glistening with oils that protected them from the harsh sun of their homeland. From the cold steppes of Scythia came cavalry whose horses seemed to move as extensions of their riders' bodies, while the warriors themselves wore armor of hardened leather, reinforced with plates of gold that caught the light like scales of some legendary dragon. The Indians brought war elephants, whose very presence seemed to shrink the horizon, massive creatures whose trumpeting calls echoed across the plains of Sardis like the voices of primordial gods. Their mahouts, skilled in the ancient art of elephant warfare, guided their charges with subtle commands that spoke of centuries of partnership between man and beast. Alongside them marched regiments of Indian infantry, whose cotton garments were dyed in brilliant colors that had never been seen in the western provinces of the empire, their weapons forged from steel that held an edge sharper than any bronze blade. From the islands and coastal cities of Phoenicia came the naval contingents, men whose knowledge of wind and wave had carried Persian influence across the Mediterranean, and whose ships bore the wealth of distant lands in their holds. Their vessels, painted in brilliant blues and reds that honored the sea gods of their ancestors, filled every harbor and anchorage along the western coast of Anatolia. The captains and navigators among them bore charts written on papyrus and carved into bronze tablets, marking every reef, current, and safe harbor from the Pillars of Hercules to the mouth of the Tanais. As spring approached in the 4th year of preparation, Xerxes himself departed from his winter palace at Susa, traveling westward along the royal road with a retinue that included the flower of Persian nobility and the sacred fire that had burned continuously since the days of Cyrus the Great. The king's passage transformed the gathering at Sardis into something approaching a religious festival, for the presence of the King of Kings invested every subsequent action with the weight of divine approval and imperial destiny. The parade grounds outside Sardis became a theatre where the power of the Persian Empire displayed itself in all its magnificent diversity. Regiment after regiment passed in review before the golden throne of Xerxes, their weapons glinting in the Mediterranean sun, and their battle standards snapping in the wind that blew down from the hills of Lydia. The immortals marched in perfect formation, their spear points creating a bronze forest above heads covered in felt caps adorned with the royal insignia, while their shields bore the winged sun disk that symbolized the divine protection of Ahura Mazda. Behind them came the contingents of the empire, in an order that reflected both military necessity and diplomatic precedence. The Medes, dressed in their traditional flowing robes but carrying weapons of war, represented the ancient partnership that had created the Persian dominion. Assyrians bore the rectangular shields and long spears of their ancestors, while Babylonians brought siege equipment that spoke of their mastery over fortified cities. From every corner of the known world they came, until the very earth seemed to groan beneath the weight of their numbers, and the air itself trembled with the sound of their marching feet. The final count, when the scribes had tallied every warrior, servant, and camp follower, exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the king's advisors. Nearly 2 million souls had gathered at Sardis, creating a host whose size dwarfed every previous military expedition in human history. The supply trains alone stretched for hundreds of miles, while the herds of livestock required to feed such numbers had stripped the pastures of western Anatolia bare. Yet, for all its unprecedented scale, the great army remained only the visible manifestation of an imperial will that had decided to reshape the balance of power between East and West, between the ancient civilizations of Asia and the young republics of Greece that dared to challenge the natural order of the world. The preparations complete, the vast encampment at Sardis began its final transformation from a staging ground into the launching point of history's greatest military expedition. As the last winter snows melted from the hills of Lydia, the Persian army stirred like some colossal beast awakening from slumber. The sound that rose from the camp defied description. Tens of thousands of voices speaking in dozens of tongues, the creak of leather and bronze, the neighing of horses from distant steppes, the shuffle of countless feet preparing for the march that would carry them across continents. Xerxes himself stood at the heart of this vast organism, his presence radiating outward through the ranks like ripples on still water, binding together this unprecedented assembly of nations under the golden standard of Persia. The march westward from Sardis unfolded like the opening of an ancient scroll, revealing landscape after landscape as the Persian host moved across the breadth of Anatolia. The columns stretched beyond the horizon in both directions, a river of humanity flowing across the ancient world. At its head rode the immortals, their spear points catching the morning light like stars fallen to earth, while behind them came the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda, carried by the Magi in vessels that had never been allowed to cool. The dust raised by this immense procession hung in the air like a permanent cloud, visible from mountain peaks, days before the actual army appeared, announcing to the scattered settlements and nomadic tribes that something unprecedented was moving across the face of the earth. Each day's march revealed new wonders and challenges as the expedition encountered the diverse peoples and terrains of western Anatolia. Rivers swollen with spring melt required the construction of bridges by Persian engineers, while mountain passes demanded careful negotiation to prevent the column from becoming hopelessly strung out across impossible terrain. Local populations watched in amazement as contingents passed. Scythian horsemen with their distinctive pointed caps, Indian war elephants swaying like mobile fortresses, Arab camel riders whose mounts filled the air with their exotic scent. The logistics of feeding and watering such a force strained the resources of entire regions. Yet the Persian administrative machine functioned with remarkable efficiency, its supply lines stretching back across the empire like the arteries of some vast organism. As the expedition approached the shores of the Hellespont, the magnitude of the undertaking that lay ahead began to crystallize in the minds of both commanders and common soldiers. The narrow strait that separated Asia from Europe had been spanned by Xerxes' engineers with a marvel of ancient technology. Twin bridges, constructed from hundreds of ships, lashed together with cables of flax and papyrus, their decks covered with planking and earth to allow the passage of men and animals. The bridges stretched across nearly a mile of choppy water, their surfaces undulating gently with the movement of the tide, creating the illusion of solid roadways suspended impossibly above the wine-dark sea. Standing at the water's edge, the Persian king could gaze across to the far shore where European soil awaited the first footsteps of his countless host. The crossing itself began at dawn on a morning when the winds lay still and the Hellespont stretched like polished bronze beneath the early sun. The first contingents to cross were the sacred cavalry, their horses stepping carefully onto the unfamiliar surface of the pontoon bridges, ears pricked forward nervously as they sensed the water moving beneath the wooden planking. Behind them came the flower of Persian nobility, their purple cloaks and golden ornaments creating a river of colour that flowed steadily from the Asian shore toward the distant hills of Thrace. The bridges groaned and swayed under the weight of the procession, their supporting ships rising and falling with the gentle swell of the strait. Yet they held firm against the enormous burden placed upon them. Hour after hour, the crossing continued as regiment after regiment made the passage from one continent to another. The sound of marching feet on wooden planks created a rhythm that echoed across the water, while the creaking of rope and timber provided a constant undertone to the great migration. Persian heralds, stationed at intervals along the bridges, called out encouragement and instruction, their voices carrying across the strait to announce the progress of the crossing to those still waiting on the Asian shore. Xerxes himself made the passage surrounded by his bodyguard, pausing at the center of the span to offer prayers to the gods of sea and sky, his words carried away by the salt breeze that stirred his robes and the horsehair plume of his golden crown. The landing on European soil marked a moment of profound significance, though it passed without ceremony or fanfare. The first Persian soldiers to set foot on the far shore simply continued their steady advance inland, their passage noted only by the gulls that wheeled overhead and the small communities of Greek fishermen who watched from distant headlands. Yet something fundamental had changed in the balance of the ancient world. The great empire of the East had physically crossed into the domain of the West, carrying with it ambitions that would reshape the political landscape of the Mediterranean. The bridges themselves seemed to symbolize this historic moment, their timber spans creating a temporary union between continents that had remained separate since the world was young. As the days passed, the crossing took on an almost dreamlike quality, with contingents from the furthest reaches of the empire making their passage beneath skies that ranged from crystal clear to heavy with spring clouds. Ethiopian warriors with their lion-skin shields crossed alongside Caspian tribesmen whose horses had never seen the sea, while Indian infantry marched in ranks beside Arab spearmen whose ancestors had roamed the desert wastes since time immemorial. Each group brought its own customs and battle cries, its own gods and talismans, yet all were bound together by their allegiance to the King of Kings, who had summoned them to this unprecedented enterprise. The completion of the crossing found the Persian host assembled on the plains of Thrace, their numbers so vast that they seemed to carpet the earth itself. Supply trains and baggage wagons continued to stream across the bridges for days after the last combat troops had reached European soil, bringing with them the material wealth of half the world: silk from distant China, spices from Indian markets, precious metals from the mines of Anatolia, and craftwork from artisans whose skills had been perfected over generations of imperial patronage. The very ground seemed to groan under the weight of this accumulation, while the local population could only watch in wonder as their modest farmland was transformed into a staging area for the conquest of continents. Now began the march through Thrace, that wild and mountainous region that formed the bridge between the civilized world of the Greek cities and the vast steppes of Scythia. The terrain presented new challenges as the Persian host moved northward along the coast, their route taking them through dense forests where the trees seemed to close behind them like a green curtain, and across rivers that ran swift and cold with mountain snowmelt. Thracian tribes watched from hidden valleys as the great column passed, some offering submission and tribute, others melting away into the wilderness, rather than face the overwhelming might of the Persian war machine. The march took on a relentless quality, each day bringing new horizons and fresh challenges as the expedition pressed deeper into European territory, leaving behind the familiar landscapes of Asia for the unknown lands that lay ahead on their path toward the heart of Greece. The great host that had crossed the Hellespont on their floating bridges now moved like a living river across the landscape of northern Greece, their bronze spear points catching the morning light as countless thousands marched in formation. The Persian army had swollen to proportions that defied comprehension, with contingents from across the known world bearing their distinctive weapons and wearing the colours of distant lands. Scythian horsemen rode alongside Egyptian infantry, while Phoenician marines prepared their ships for coastal operations, all united under the golden standard of Xerxes, King of Kings. As this immense force flowed southward through the mountain passes of Thessaly, word of their approach raced ahead like wildfire through the Greek city-states. In Sparta, the Gerousia met in solemn council, their weathered faces grave as they contemplated the magnitude of the approaching storm. The Athenians, meanwhile, found themselves caught between their devotion to their homeland and the practical recognition that their wooden walls upon the Acropolis could never withstand such overwhelming numbers. Themistocles, the cunning naval strategist, urged his countrymen to place their faith in their ships, interpreting the oracle's cryptic words about wooden walls as a reference to their growing fleet of triremes. The narrow pass at Thermopylae emerged as the obvious place where Greek courage might make its stand against Persian multitude. Here, where the mountains pressed close against the sea, leaving only a wagon's width of passage between the cliffs and the waters, geography itself seemed to offer hope against impossible odds. The hot springs that gave the place its name bubbled up from the earth, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where steam rose from sacred pools, while overhead, eagles circled on thermals rising from the sun-baked rocks. King Leonidas of Sparta arrived at this fateful bottleneck with his personal guard of 300 warriors, each man selected not merely for his skill with spear and shield, but for having sons to carry on his lineage. These were men in the prime of life, their bronze-muscled bodies honed by decades of training in the agoge, their red cloaks brilliant against their polished bronze armor. They took their positions along the narrow path with the calm deliberation of men who understood that death in battle was the highest honor their culture could bestow. Alongside the Spartans came contingents from other Greek cities: Thespians, who refused to abandon their Spartan allies despite having no obligation to stay, Thebans, whose loyalty remained questionable, and Phocians, who knew these mountain paths like shepherds know their flocks. The total number of Greeks defending the pass numbered perhaps 7,000, a force that seemed almost insignificant against the approaching Persian tide, yet their positioning transformed weakness into potential strength. When Xerxes first beheld the Greek position, seated upon his golden throne carried by bearers, the sight must have seemed almost comical. His advanced scouts reported that the Spartans were exercising naked in the sun and combing their long hair, activities that appeared to the Persian mind as evidence of either madness or complete indifference to the approaching doom. The great king sent messengers demanding the surrender of their weapons, only to receive Leonidas's legendary reply that the Persians were welcome to come and take them. For 4 days, Xerxes waited, expecting the Greeks to lose their nerve and disperse. The Persian camp sprawled across the plain like a vast city of tents, with smoke from countless cooking fires rising into the clear mountain air. Merchants and camp followers created temporary markets between the regimental encampments, while the sound of different languages and the exotic scents of foreign spices created an atmosphere of cosmopolitan abundance that contrasted sharply with the austere discipline of the Greek defenders. On the 5th day, the assault began in earnest. The Medes advanced first, their wicker shields and short spears, suitable for the mobile warfare of the steppes, but poorly adapted to the crushing press of battle in such confined quarters. Behind them came the Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard of 10,000 warriors, their golden spear butts glinting as they moved forward in perfect formation. The sound of their approach was like distant thunder. The rhythmic tramp of feet and the metallic whisper of weapons and armor, creating a symphony of approaching death. The Greeks met this assault with the disciplined fury that had made them masters of infantry warfare. Their bronze spear points, longer than those of their enemies, created a hedge of death that channeled the Persian advance into an ever-narrowing funnel. Bodies began to pile in the pass, creating obstacles that disrupted the neat formations of the attacking forces. The Spartans fought with mechanical precision, their shields locked together in an unbreakable wall, their spears thrusting forward in unison like the heartbeat of some great bronze beast. Wave after wave of Persian troops hurled themselves against this implacable defense, each assault breaking like ocean waves against coastal rocks. The narrow confines of the pass prevented Xerxes from bringing his numerical superiority to bear effectively, while the superior armor and longer spears of the Greeks gave them decisive advantages in the close quarters fighting. By evening, the pass was carpeted with Persian dead, while the Greek losses remained minimal. The pattern repeated for 2 more days, with different contingents of the Persian army attempting to break through the Greek line. Arab camel corps, Indian infantry with their cotton armor and bamboo spears, Thracian peltasts with their distinctive crescent shields, all met the same fate in the grinding meat grinder of the pass. Xerxes grew increasingly frustrated, his confidence in swift victory evaporating like morning mist before the implacable resistance of these few hundred Greeks. Then came the betrayal that changed everything. A local Greek named Ephialtes, driven by promises of Persian gold, revealed the existence of a mountain path that would allow the Immortals to circle behind the Greek position. This narrow track, known as the Anapeia path, wound through the high country where shepherds drove their flocks in summer, threading between peaks that most armies would consider impassable. The discovery of the flanking force precipitated the final act of the drama. Most of the Greek contingents withdrew when they realized their position was hopeless, but Leonidas and his 300 Spartans remained, along with the loyal Thespians who refused to abandon their allies. They repositioned themselves on a small hill within the pass, forming a circle with their shields as Persian forces closed in from both directions. The final battle was brief but ferocious. The remaining Greeks fought back to back, their spears stabbing outward like the quills of a cornered porcupine, until their bronze points were blunted and broken. Then they drew their swords, the iron blades singing through the morning air as they carved through the encircling enemy. When their weapons were gone, they fought with their hands and even their teeth, maintaining their defiance to the very end. Even as the heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae was reaching its bloody conclusion, the Persian navy was completing its domination of Greek waters. The combined fleets of Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia had swept aside the hastily assembled Greek naval forces, opening the sea lanes for supplies and reinforcements. with both land and sea routes secure. Nothing now stood between Xerxes and the rich cities of central Greece. The news of Thermopylae's fall spread southward faster than the advancing Persian army, carried by exhausted messengers whose horses were lathered with sweat and foam. In Athens, the debate over evacuation reached fever pitch as families gathered their most precious possessions, while casting anguished looks toward the Acropolis where their ancestors lay buried. The decision to abandon their city to the flames represented perhaps the most wrenching choice in Greek history, a sacrifice of the present for hope of future victory. Within days, the Persian advance guard appeared on the hills surrounding Athens, their colourful banners snapping in the wind as they gazed down upon the greatest prize of their campaign. The city lay spread below them like a jewel, its marble temples gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun, its agora and residential districts connected by winding streets that had witnessed centuries of democratic debate and philosophical inquiry. The sack of Athens proceeded with methodical thoroughness. Persian soldiers poured through the abandoned streets, their torches setting fire to wooden roofs and doorframes, while their axes rang against marble statues. The Acropolis, that sacred heart of Athenian civilization, became an inferno visible for miles across Attica, its flames reaching toward the heavens like a massive funeral pyre for Greek hopes and dreams. The smoke that rose from the burning city darkened the sky, creating an artificial twilight that seemed to symbolize the eclipse of Hellenic freedom beneath the shadow of Persian might. The flames that consumed Athens cast their amber glow across the waters of the Saronic Gulf, where the destiny of two worlds would soon collide in a dance of bronze and timber, blood and brine. As smoke from the sacred Acropolis drifted eastward, like the prayers of a vanquished people, Xerxes stood upon his golden throne, positioned high on the slopes of Mount Aigaleo, believing himself witness to the final act of his grand symphony of conquest. Below him, stretched across the narrow straits of Salamis, lay the greatest naval armada the ancient world had ever assembled. Over 1,000 ships bearing the might of 46 nations, their painted eyes gleaming like those of sea monsters stirring from the depths. The Persian fleet moved with the ponderous majesty of a migration, each vessel heavy with the accumulated wealth and warriors of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Phoenician triremes cut through the morning waters with their distinctive purple sails, while Egyptian ships rode low and broad, their hulls darkened by the silt of the Nile. Cilician vessels bobbed alongside Cypriot galleys and the sleek warships of Ionia. Those Greek cities that had bent the knee to Persian gold formed a bitter irony in this theatre of fraternal conflict. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of empire, heavy with the scent of tar and rope, the metallic tang of bronze weapons, and the salt breath of a sea that would soon run red. From his elevated vantage point, Xerxes could observe the meticulous choreography he had orchestrated, each movement of his naval commanders flowing like notes in a composition written by the gods themselves. The king had learned the lessons of Marathon, where his father Darius had stumbled against Greek steel and stubborn earth. This time, there would be no single point of failure, no narrow beach where Persian numbers meant nothing. The Straits of Salamis would become a cauldron where the remnants of Greek resistance would be boiled away like morning mist before the rising sun. His admirals had positioned their forces with mathematical precision, sealing every avenue of escape, transforming the waters into a vast net from which no Greek vessel could slip free. The morning light revealed the desperate gamble of Themistocles and his allied fleet. Some 370 ships huddled in the sheltered waters behind Salamis Island like sheep before wolves. These vessels bore the scars of recent battles and hasty repairs, patches of new wood gleaming pale against weathered hulls, replacement oars that had not yet learned the rhythm of their companions, and crews whose faces carried the hollow look of men who had watched their homes burn. Yet, something else moved among these ships, something that Persian gold could not purchase, nor numbers overcome. The terrible fury of the dispossessed, the cold fire that burns in hearts that have nothing left to lose. As the Persian fleet advanced into the straits, the waters themselves seemed to constrict around them. the vast formation that had appeared so magnificent in open sea now compressed into an unwieldy mass. The very geography that Xerxes had chosen as his trap began to reveal its double edge. For the narrow waters that prevented Greek escape also limited Persian maneuverability. Ships that had moved in perfect formation across the Aegean now found themselves pressed against their neighbours, oars tangling and hulls scraping as the front ranks slowed and the rear continued to push forward with inexorable momentum. The first collision came not between enemy vessels, but within the Persian ranks themselves, as an Egyptian ship, attempting to turn away from a Greek ram, struck a Phoenician trireme amidships. The sound carried across the water like thunder, followed by the agonized creaking of splitting timber and the cries of men plunging into the cold embrace of the straits. This single accident rippled outward through the Persian formation like a stone cast into still water, each disruption creating another as ships struggled to maintain position in waters too narrow for their numbers. From his throne, Xerxes watched his carefully orchestrated symphony begin to dissolve into cacophony. The Greek ships, smaller and more maneuverable, darted between the Persian vessels like wolves among a flock, their bronze-sheathed rams finding gaps in formations that had seemed impenetrable moments before. The distinctive crack of breaking oars created a percussion that echoed off the surrounding hills as Greek triremes swept past their larger opponents, their crews working in perfect synchronization, born of desperate training and shared purpose. The waters of Salamis began to change color as the morning progressed, the clear blue darkening to wine red as ships split open like overripe fruit, spilling their human cargo into the unforgiving sea. Persian sailors, weighted down by elaborate armor that spoke of distant campaigns and imperial glory, sank beneath waves that cared nothing for the gold thread in their garments or the exotic spices in their hair. Greek marines leaped from ship to ship with the agility of their mountainous homeland, their simple bronze and leather proving more practical than the ornate panoply of empire. The wind itself seemed to turn against the Persian cause, shifting to blow from the west and driving the smoke of burning ships into the faces of Xerxes' admirals. What had begun as a glorious morning, with banners snapping proudly in the breeze and the sun glinting off 1,000 bronze rams, transformed into a nightmare of confusion and flame. Ships that had sailed from the harbours of Tyre and Sidon, that had weathered the storms of the Black Sea and navigated by stars visible only from the roof of the world, now lay broken and burning in waters so narrow a strong swimmer could cross them in minutes. The Persian numbers, which had been their greatest strength in the open waters beyond the Aegean, became their most terrible weakness in the confined space of the straits. Ships found themselves unable to retreat without ramming their own allies, unable to advance without exposing their flanks to Greek attack. The elaborate tactical formations that had served the empire well in river battles along the Nile and coastal actions off Phoenicia proved worse than useless in waters where every maneuver carried the risk of collision with friendly vessels. As the sun reached its zenith, the scale of the catastrophe became clear even to the most optimistic of Persian observers. More than 200 ships of the imperial fleet had been destroyed or captured, their crews either drowned in the wine-dark waters or taken prisoner by enemies who spoke the same language as many of their Ionian allies. The carefully maintained supply lines that had stretched back across the Aegean like golden chains now lay severed, their protecting vessels scattered to the winds or resting in the depths where no imperial treasure could retrieve them. From his golden throne, Xerxes watched the dream of European conquest dissolve like salt in water. The great enterprise that had begun with such promise, the bridge across the Hellespont, the canal through the Athos Peninsula, the numberless host that had darkened the roads of Thrace, all of it reduced to floating debris and the bitter taste of defeat. The king who had demanded earth and water from every Greek city, who had ordered the sea itself scourged for its impudence, now faced the terrible arithmetic of naval warfare, where courage and cunning could triumph over mere numbers. The retreat began as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-stained straits, Persian ships limping away from waters that had promised glory and delivered only humiliation. The great fleet that had once stretched beyond the horizon now fled in disorder, leaving behind not only their dead, but something far more precious: the aura of invincibility that had cloaked Persian arms since the days of Cyrus the Great. The empire that had conquered Babylon and humbled Egypt, that had made the Indus its eastern border and dreamed of planting its standards beside the pillars of Heracles, found itself turned back by a handful of Greek cities and the bitter determination of free men who would not kneel. As twilight settled over the straits of Salamis, the waters gradually stilled, carrying their grim cargo of broken ships and shattered dreams toward the wine-dark horizon, where the sun descended like a great bronze shield, bloodied by the day's carnage and reflecting the end of Persian hopes for dominion over the wine-bright seas of the west. The great Persian host began its long journey home across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, their bronze-tipped spears catching the last rays of autumn sunlight as the ships turned eastward toward the familiar shores of Asia Minor. Behind them, the Greek mainland receded into purple shadows, its mountains and olive groves holding secrets that would echo through the corridors of time. The retreat was not the chaotic rout that later chroniclers would sometimes paint, but rather the measured withdrawal of an empire that had tested its strength against the unexpected resilience of divided city-states and found the cost too dear to bear. Xerxes himself sailed in silence aboard his royal galley, the golden lion banners still flying proudly despite the bitter taste of Salamis that lingered in the salt air. The king, who had once stood before the Hellespont and commanded the very waters to submit, now watched those same waters carry him away from dreams that had seemed as solid as the great walls of Persepolis. His dark eyes, which had gazed upon the burning temples of Athens with satisfaction, now reflected something deeper and more complex as the distance between his fleet and Greece widened with each stroke of the oars. The Persian withdrawal from Europe marked not merely the end of a military campaign, but the close of an age when the boundaries of the known world seemed fluid enough for a single will to reshape them entirely. The bridges that had once spanned the Hellespont were dismantled, their massive timbers floating away like the scattered thoughts of an empire learning the weight of its own ambitions. The roads that had carried Persian messengers racing westward now felt the measured tread of soldiers returning home, their bronze armor dulled by dust, and their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the face of war and found it neither glorious nor simple. In the royal pavilions that dotted the slow progression homeward, scribes continued their patient work of recording the deeds of kings, though their reed pens moved with less certainty now as they sought words to capture the complexity of what had transpired. The great experiment in extending Persian dominion over the fractured Greek world had revealed truths about power and resistance that would ripple outward through the centuries like stones cast into still water. The empire that had absorbed Egypt and Babylon with relative ease discovered that conquest sometimes required more than superior numbers and organizational skill. Darius, in his marble tomb at Nakhshe-Rustam, seemed to gaze eternally eastward toward the heart of his empire, his carved features bearing witness to the enduring strength of Persian rule over its vast Asian domains. The father's vision of ordered administration and benevolent kingship lived on in the provincial capitals, where Persian governors still held court beneath the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. His legacy was not diminished by his son's setbacks in Greece, for Darius had built something more enduring than any single military campaign, a system of governance that could bend without breaking, absorbing the shocks of defeat as easily as it had once celebrated victory. The retreating Persian forces carried with them more than wounded pride and tarnished dreams. They bore the accumulated wisdom of an empire learning its limits, understanding for the first time that even the greatest of powers must choose its battles carefully. The gold that had once flowed freely to Greek allies and mercenaries now returned to Persian treasuries, where it would fund not further expeditions westward, but the patient work of consolidation and internal development that Darius had always favoured over conquest for its own sake. In the palaces of Susa and Persepolis, The great reception halls continued to echo with the footsteps of tribute bearers from across the known world, though the delegations from Greek cities were notably fewer now. The throne of the King of Kings remained as magnificent as ever, its back adorned with the eternal struggle between good and evil that lay at the heart of Persian cosmology. Xerxes took his place upon that throne with the knowledge that rulership required not just the power to command, but the wisdom to know when command itself might prove insufficient. The Persian Empire's retreat from Greece became, in the fullness of time, not a sign of weakness, but evidence of a mature civilization's ability to reassess its priorities and adjust its ambitions accordingly. The administrative systems that Darius had refined continued to govern efficiently across 3 continents, binding together peoples of countless languages and customs under the relatively light hand of Persian rule. The great highways still carried merchants and messengers with their precious cargoes of silk and spices, ideas and innovations flowing along trade routes that Persian engineering had made secure and profitable. As seasons passed into years and years into decades, the Greek expedition came to seem like a brief and costly detour in the long history of an empire that had always looked primarily eastward toward India and the rising sun. The kings who had dared to challenge the West discovered that their true legacy lay not in military conquest, but in the patient work of cultural synthesis that had always been Persia's greatest strength. The Zoroastrian fire temples continued to burn steadily in cities from the Mediterranean to the Indus, their eternal flames symbolizing the enduring nature of Persian civilization, even as political boundaries shifted like sand in the desert wind. The echoes of Persian ambition would resonate through history long after the immediate pain of defeat had faded into memory. Greek writers would remember Darius and Xerxes as the archetypal Eastern despots, their vast armies and unlimited wealth serving as foils for tales of Greek courage and freedom. Yet the Persian records, carved in stone and preserved in royal archives, told a different story. One of kings who had inherited an ancient tradition of universal rule and who had pushed that tradition to its logical conclusion by attempting to unite East and West under a single crown. In the quiet courtyards of Persian gardens, where peacocks strutted among rose bushes and the sound of running water provided a constant murmur of contentment, philosophers and priests continued to ponder the great questions that had always fascinated Persian thinkers. The failure to conquer Greece became, in their meditations, simply another example of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, that defined the human condition. The kings who had challenged the West were remembered not as failures, but as heroes who had dared to dream of a world united in peace and prosperity under the benevolent rule of enlightened monarchs. The setting sun cast long shadows across the great platform at Persepolis as another day ended in the heart of the Persian Empire. The reliefs carved into the stone showed eternal processions of tribute bearers and subject peoples, their faces serene in their acknowledgement of Persian supremacy. The empire endured, its roots too deep and its branches too widespread to be shaken by any single military reverse. Darius and Xerxes had challenged Greece and found it unconquerable, but in doing so they had revealed both the limits and the enduring strengths of their own civilization. Their legacy lived on, not in the conquest of distant lands, but in the patient work of governing well the vast territories that remained under Persian rule, where their descendants would continue to reign for generations yet to come, their memory preserved in stone and story.